Marlon Brando walked out from behind that curtain, and the studio audience didn't cheer. They went completely silent, because John Wayne was already sitting in that chair, and every person in that room understood exactly what was about to happen. Wait, because what Carson did next with one single question, and what Wayne said in the 30 seconds after that, would split Hollywood down the middle in a way that no movie, no protest, and no Oscar speech ever quite managed to do. And the reason nobody talks about what really happened that night has everything to do with a decision three men made in a green room before the cameras ever turned on. It was a Tuesday night in March of 1974. The Tonight Show had been taping at NBC's Burbank studios for 2 years by then, and the building had a particular smell to it: old coffee, cigarette smoke, baked into the carpet, the faint chemical edge of fresh makeup sitting under the studio lights. Johnny Carson had been doing this for 12 years. He knew his stage the way a man knows the floor plan of his own house in the dark, every creak, every angle, every pocket of dead air that needed filling. He also knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what he was doing when he made a certain phone call to a certain publicist in January of that year and said, quietly, that he'd like both of them on the same night. Both of them. John Wayne and Marlon Brando. The producer who took the notes from that conversation would say later, to a colleague over drinks, that he'd written it down and then stared at the paper for a full minute before he believed what he'd written. Because these were not two men who occupied the same Hollywood. They hadn't for 20 years. They'd never worked together, never been photographed together, never appeared in the same room at the same time in any documented way. They were the same industry's two different answers to the same question. What does an American man look like on screen? And the answers they'd given were so completely opposite that putting them on the same couch felt less like a booking decision and more like a physics experiment. Now hold this detail, because it matters to everything that follows. The show taped at 7:30. Both men had confirmed. Both men were in the building, and Carson had exactly 4 hours to either make history or watch one of them walk out that door before the cameras turned on. Notice what was sitting in the air between them before a single word had been spoken. It was March of 1974, 12 months, almost to the week, since the 45th Academy Awards, since Sacheen Littlefeather had walked to that podium in a buckskin dress and declined an Oscar on behalf of a man who hadn't bothered to show up, since the audience had booed and applauded in the same breath, since John Wayne, who had been backstage that night, who had been in that building, who had his own scheduled moment in that ceremony, had said afterward for the record what he thought about the whole business. If he had something to say, he should have appeared that night and stated his views instead of taking some little unknown girl and dressing her up in an Indian outfit. Brando had read that quote. The New York Times had printed his letter, the one Littlefeather hadn't been allowed to read in full, and in the months after Oscar night, Brando had given exactly one television interview on a rival network's late-night program, in which he'd sat with 4 Native American representatives and talked for an hour about broken treaties and Hollywood myth-making, and the specific damage done by decades of Western films. He hadn't mentioned Wayne by name. He hadn't needed to. Wayne had seen that interview. So here they were, the green room at NBC Burbank, 40 minutes before air, and John Wayne was sitting in a chair with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and the door opened, and Marlon Brando walked in. Look at that moment from the outside, if you can. Two of the largest physical presences in the history of American cinema, in a room the size of a suburban living room, with a coffee machine in the corner and fluorescent lights overhead, and a production assistant trying very hard to be invisible near the door. Wayne was 66 years old, had survived lung cancer a decade earlier, and still carried himself like a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves when he entered them. Brando was 49, and moved with the particular deliberate quality of a man who understood that slowness could be its own kind of power. They did not shake hands. Wayne looked at him. Brando looked back. The production assistant later told a friend that the silence lasted about 8 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then Wayne said, "Marlon," and Brando said, "Duke." And that was the entire green room conversation. 8 seconds of eye contact and 2 names. And then Brando poured himself a glass of water and sat down on the far side of the room. And Wayne went back to his cold coffee. And they waited for someone to come and tell them it was time. Carson knew, by the time he walked out to his desk that night, that something was different. He could feel it in the audience. The particular quality of attention that wasn't excitement exactly, but something closer to held breath. A collective awareness that the normal rules of the evening might not apply. He did his monologue. He introduced his first guest, a comedian whose name nobody who was there that night could later remember, because nobody was paying attention to the comedian. They were watching the curtain. Wayne came out first. The audience gave him the kind of reception that was less applause and more acknowledgement. The sound a crowd makes when it recognizes something. It's known for a long time, something that belongs to its own history. He sat down. He crossed one leg over the other. He put his hand on his knee and looked at Carson with the expression that 40 years of facing cameras had made completely natural, open, easy. The faint suggestion of a smile that said he was comfortable here, that this was his territory, that whatever happened next was fine with him. Carson asked him about his new picture. Wayne talked about it for 3 minutes. The audience laughed twice. Everything was normal. 3 hours had passed since both men had arrived in that building. 1 hour remained before the segment that Carson had been building toward all evening. The clock in the control room was visible from the director's chair. The director would say later that he'd been watching it more than he'd been watching his monitors. Then Carson said, "We have another guest joining us tonight." And the curtain moved. The silence that came over that audience when Brando walked out was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of recognition. The sudden collective understanding of what had been arranged, and why, and what it meant that these 2 men were now going to be sitting 3 feet apart on national television. Brando walked to the couch with the same deliberate slowness he'd walked everywhere, since he'd decided that deliberateness was a form of statement. He sat down. He looked at Carson. He did not look at Wayne. Wayne did not look at Brando. Carson let the silence sit for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough for the audience to feel it, not long enough for it to become uncomfortable. And then he said, "Gentlemen, I've been trying to get you both on the same show for about 10 years. Wayne said, "Is that right?" Not a question. A statement, delivered flat, that communicated several things simultaneously. That he was aware of what was happening, that he had agreed to it, and that agreeing to it was a thing he was choosing to treat as ordinary. Brando said nothing. He picked up his glass of water. Carson smiled the smile of a man who had spent 12 years learning to smile in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment. "I thought," he said, "since you're both here, I'd love to hear what you each think the Western actually means. As a genre, what it says about America." Stop for a second and understand what Carson just did, because that question looks, on the surface, like a film question, a genre question, something you could answer by talking about landscapes and heroes and the myth of the frontier. But every person in that room, Wayne, Brando, the audience, the cameras, understood immediately that it wasn't a film question at all. It was a question about Oscar night. It was a question about Wounded Knee. It was a question about Sakine Littlefeather and a buckskin dress and a letter printed in the New York Times. Carson had wrapped all of that into 6 words. What does the Western mean? And set it down between them, like a match set down next to something dry. Wayne moved first. He uncrossed his leg. He leaned forward slightly, not toward Brando, toward Carson, and he said, "The Western means something simple. It means a man does what he has to do. He protects what's his. He keeps his word. That's what it's always meant, and that's what it'll keep meaning." The audience applauded. Of course they did. It was a John Wayne answer. Clean, declarative, structured, like a piece of load-bearing architecture. One sentence built on top of another. No gaps, no doubt, the whole thing finished before you'd realized it had started. Brando let the applause die. He waited a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he said, without raising his voice, "I think that's part of it. The part that makes people feel good." He paused. "The other part is what happens to everyone who isn't the man who does what he has to do. The people whose land he's protecting it from. The people who end up on the wrong side of that word he keeps." Another pause. "Those people were in the Western too. We just didn't put their names in the credits." The audience didn't applaud. They also didn't boo. They made the sound that audiences make when something has been said that they don't quite know how to respond to. A low, collective exhale. The sound of a room recalibrating. Wayne's jaw moved. Not much. If you weren't looking for it, you'd have missed it. But he was looking at Brando now, and Brando was looking at him, and Carson was very carefully looking at neither of them. "I've heard that argument," Wayne said. "I imagine you have," Brando said, "and I'll tell you what I think of it." Wayne sat back. He was doing the thing he did, the thing that directors had been trying to capture for 4 decades, where stillness became its own form of presence, where not moving was more powerful than moving. "I think it's easy to sit back and decide that everything that built this country was wrong. I think it's easy to do that when you're living in a house in Beverly Hills, on money you made from the country you're busy calling rotten." The audience stirred. Someone, it was never identified who, made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a gasp. Brando looked at him for a long moment. His expression did not change. This was the thing about Brando that Wayne had perhaps not fully accounted for. The man had spent 30 years learning to do more with stillness than most actors could do with movement, and he was not going to be rattled by a direct hit. He'd been hit directly before. He'd been hit by directors who thought they could break him, and producers who thought they could manage him, and 2 ex-wives and a son who was already on his way to becoming a problem. A remark about Beverly Hills was not going to move him. "You're right," Brando said. "I live well. So do you." He set down his water glass. "The question isn't whether we've benefited from the country. The question is whether we're willing to look at what the country cost and who paid. Remember that this is live television. 12 million people watching. Carson with a yellow notepad in front of him that he wasn't going to be using tonight. The band behind the curtain that nobody was thinking about. The audience that had come expecting a talk show and gotten something else entirely." Wayne said, "I know what it cost." "I don't think you do," Brando said. "I think you know what it cost your grandfather. I think you know what it cost the men who built the railroads and tamed the frontier and all the other things we put in the movies. I don't think you know, and I'm not sure you want to know, what it cost the people who were already there when your grandfather arrived." The room went very quiet. This was the moment. And look, this is the moment you need to hold on to, because it's the one that everyone who was there that night would describe differently in the years afterward. The one that split the accounts right down the middle, because what John Wayne did next was not what anyone expected. Not the audience. Not Carson. Not, probably, Brando. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He didn't do the thing that his whole career had trained him to do, which was fill the space, dominate the frame, make himself the largest thing in the room. He sat with it for a moment. Just sat with it, the way you sit with something heavy. And then he said, quietly, "I made pictures about the West. I didn't make history." Brando said, "No, but the pictures made history." That's the difference. Carson, who had been holding himself very still for the last 4 minutes, chose this moment to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, and then he stopped, because he didn't actually have a sentence to follow that word with. He started again. "I think what I'm hearing." "Johnny," Wayne said, without looking at Carson. He was still looking at Brando. Let him finish. This was the thing. The moment that the production assistant and 2 camera operators and the audio technician who was closest to the couch would all mention when they talked about that night in the years afterward. John Wayne telling Johnny Carson to let Marlon Brando finish, not as a concession, not as a defeat, as something else. Something that didn't have a clean name. Brando looked at Wayne for a moment, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but something that lived in the territory between the two. "I think," Brando said, more slowly now, "that you're a better man than the movies you made. I've always thought that, and I think you know, somewhere, that the movies did damage. I think that's why you got angry last year, because somewhere you know." The audience was completely silent. Wayne looked at him. His hand on his knee had tightened slightly, the grip of a man holding something down, rather than reaching for something. He said, "What I know is that I did my job. I did it the best I knew how. And I'm not going to sit here and apologize for 40 years of work because the world decided to change the rules. Nobody's asking you to apologize," Brando said. "Sounds like it from where I'm sitting." "No," Brando shook his head. "Once. Slowly. An apology doesn't change anything. I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in whether you can look at a picture you made, any picture, take your pick, and see what I see when I look at it. And what do you see?" Brando said, "A country telling itself a story about itself, and leaving out half the people who lived in it." The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Those had been the silences of anticipation, of a room waiting to see what came next. This one was the silence of something having landed, of a room that had received something, and was now in the process of deciding what to do with it. Wayne looked away from Brando, for the first time in several minutes. He looked at the audience, at the rows of faces that he could see clearly under the studio lights, and something moved across his expression that the camera on the left side of the stage caught, but that the broadcast director didn't switch to in time, so it existed only in the raw tape, in the version that wasn't the finished show, something that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal, something private, briefly visible, then gone. He looked back at Brando. "You're a hell of an actor," he said. It was, on its face, a deflection, a pivot, the kind of thing you say when you want to change the subject without admitting you're changing the subject. But the way he said it, the way it came out flat and even, without the edge that would have made it a dismissal, and without the warmth that would have made it a compliment, put it somewhere else entirely. It landed in the room as something harder to categorize, an acknowledgement, a stopping point. The period at the end of a sentence that neither of them had quite finished writing. Brando said, "So are you." And then, unbelievably, the corner of Brando's mouth moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something smaller, something that Carson, who was watching from 3 feet away, would describe to his producer during the commercial break, using a word he didn't usually use in professional settings. Genuine. Carson said it had looked genuine. Wayne saw it, and his hand on his knee relaxed, by just enough to be visible. Carson, reading the room with the precision of a man who had spent 12 years learning to read rooms, said, "We'll take a break." And they did. During the commercial break, the production assistant brought Wayne a fresh cup of coffee. He took it. He didn't look at Brando. Brando looked at the floor. The audio technician, whose job required him to stay on the stage during breaks, would say afterward that neither man spoke during the entire 3 minutes. The control room clock now showed 9:47. 43 minutes left in the broadcast. Whatever was going to happen between these two men, the window for it was closing. But at some point, he wasn't sure exactly when, because he'd been checking a cable connection and looking away. When he looked back, Wayne had turned his cup around in his hands, and Brando was watching him do it, and neither of them was looking away. The second segment was quieter. Orson asked about current projects. Wayne talked about a picture he had in development. Brando said something about Tahiti, where he'd been spending increasing amounts of time, and about the particular quality of silence you could find there if you looked for it. Wayne said that sounded about right, and there was something in the way he said it, no irony, no edge, that made Carson glance at him quickly, as if checking to confirm who was sitting in that chair. The show ended at 10:30, exactly on time, which was the thing that struck the director most when he thought about it afterward. A night that had contained everything it had contained, and the clock had run exactly as scheduled. The audience filed out. The stage crew began the business of resetting for the next night. Nobody took a photograph of what happened in the hallway afterward. The people who were there would always mention this first. There was no photograph, as if the absence of documentation was itself the most significant detail. What there was, according to the production assistant and the audio technician and one camera operator putting away equipment, two men standing in a fluorescent-lit corridor, neither in a hurry to leave, not speaking, not quite leaving. Wayne with his coat over his arm, Brando with his hands in his pockets, standing maybe 4 feet apart, which was close enough to be intentional. The camera operator said Wayne said something, low enough that she couldn't hear the words. Brando nodded. Once, that was it. Then Wayne walked toward the exit, and Brando stood there watching him go. And whatever that moment was, it didn't have a name that either of them ever offered to anyone. What the camera operator did say, the one thing she was certain of, was that Wayne had not looked back. He'd walked to that exit door with the same steady step he'd used for 40 years, pushed through, and the corridor went quiet. The question of what Wayne had said would outlast the broadcast, outlast the decade, outlast both men, but the walk toward the door was finished. One step, one door, one choice. Look at what the night had actually been. 12 million people watching a man have something said to him that he'd been avoiding for 20 years, and choosing to sit with it instead of leaving. A man who had spent his whole career being the largest thing in any room, making himself quiet enough to hear something he didn't want to hear. Not agreeing, not apologizing, not converting, just sitting with it. For 40 years he'd played men who knew exactly what to do, and did it without hesitation. This was a man not knowing what to do, and staying in his chair anyway. It cost him something. The producer who'd arranged the booking got 3 calls the next morning from people in Wayne's professional circle who were not happy. One of them used the word ambush. Wayne himself, when asked about the evening 2 weeks later, said, "Marlon Brando is a very talented man, nothing else." The reporter wrote it down and couldn't figure out what to do with it. Brando gave no comment. He was back in Tahiti by the end of the week. What's left is the tape, the raw tape, not the broadcast version, the one where the camera on the left caught that brief, unguarded expression on Wayne's face. Some people who've seen it call it regret. Some call it recognition, the look of a man seeing something clearly that he'd been looking at sideways for a long time. Some say it was just the lights, or tiredness, or the specific neutrality of a face that spent 4 decades being the face the camera wanted. The broadcast version of that moment shows Carson's desk, whatever was on Wayne's face for those 2 seconds. The director switched away before the audience saw it. Maybe that's the story, not the argument. Arguments happen everywhere. Arguments are the surface of things. The story is the 2 seconds the director didn't air, and what might have been in them, and whether a man who had spent his entire career being absolutely certain about everything was for 2 seconds in a fluorescent-lit television studio, less certain than he'd ever been. John Wayne died in June of 1979. Stomach cancer. He was 72 years old. Marlon Brando, who was in Paris when he heard the news, said nothing publicly. The journalist who reached him by phone reported that there was a long pause on the line, and then Brando said he was the real thing, and hung up. 3 words. No elaboration. No explanation of what the real thing meant, or what it was the real version of, or whether it was a compliment or an elegy or something more complicated than either. He made you feel good. It's not a bad thing to do in life at all. Brando had said that years before the Carson night, in a magazine interview, talking about Wayne. He'd said it plainly, without irony. The interviewer had been surprised. Brando had seemed surprised that the interviewer was surprised. "I've always enjoyed watching him," he'd said. "He made movies that made people feel like things could be all right. That's not nothing." He never said whether the Carson night changed that. He never said whether those 4 minutes in a Burbank studio and the hallway afterward settled anything, or opened something, or just added to the long account that these 2 men kept with each other, and with the America that made them both. What they left behind is the gap. The thing that was said and the thing that wasn't. The 2 seconds the director switched away from. The words in the hallway that nobody heard. The 3 words Brando said on a phone from Paris 5 years later, and the silence after them, which was maybe the most honest thing either of them had managed. If you want to know what John Wayne said in that hallway, if you have a theory, if you think you know, leave it in the comments. Some silences have more than one way of being broken, and this might be one of them. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think.